Thanks very much. Good morning. Lovely to see you all. Lovely to be here. Lovely to find my way through to the room today and have a talk with you about something that may seem a little bit different. My role in kind of helping organizations look at the complex futures that face us and understand and kind of make sense of all of the strange signals that we see in day-to-day life. It kind of plays out in a number of ways, and one of them is to sometimes kind of pick up a couple of those threads, tie them together, and paint a picture that kind of casts us forward a little bit. So I want to do that for a few minutes this morning. You'll see a big parenthetical A here, a future of citizenship. I don't want to sort of put this forward as the only future of citizenship, but just kind of plant this seed in your mind as something to think about. And in particular, in your role in public administration, think about how something like this or this kind of future vision of the world might filter down into your organizations and the things that it would ask of you to do and ask you to change. And I want to talk a little bit about this idea of nation as a service. Optus will know that when you're talking about things like IT and telecom and the cloud, increasingly we describe the world as sort of being things as a service, things that come to us at the flip of a switch or the press of a button that we can access quite easily. So that's kind of what I want to talk about. What does that mean in terms of citizenship and nationhood? So just to kind of cast your mind forward for a few minutes, maybe 5-10 years from now, you or someone you know sitting at their laptop, maybe not even have a laptop, a big smartphone, a tablet, or one of those beautiful wall screens, and you're typing away and you're kind of searching and you find an ad and it says, are you tired of climate change? Do you want to reconnect with a loved one? Or do you want economic opportunity in a beautiful faraway place, or maybe somewhere just on the other side of the water? Click here and find out more. You click, a little ad runs, and you begin to see the kind of beautiful opportunities that are available in this new location. Maybe it's dry, maybe it's cooler, maybe there are fewer fires, maybe water is not rising quite as quickly, or maybe there's some new industry taking off there that you want to take advantage of. And you click through, you open up a chat window. Maybe it's something like, maybe some of you use something like Slack. Maybe some of you use Facebook Messenger. Doesn't really matter. Whatever sort of chat program you like, the window pops up, and suddenly there's a voice there that says, hi, what can I do for you today? And you say, well, I'm really interested in your country. I'm interested in the ad that I saw. I'd like to apply to be a resident. A few minutes later, quick permission to access some security details behind the scenes, maybe check a genetic database, maybe a few health records, police records, etc. You're having a kind of casual chat, and before you know it, 10 minutes have gone by, and you get, boom, an email that says, welcome. Welcome to this country. Welcome in. You can now be a citizen. Here are the rules and regulations. Click here, drag your files across. Just as easy as using something like Dropbox, you sort of move your citizenship or your residency from one folder to the next, and it's easy as that. That sounds like a really, really strange kind of experience, particularly what we know with the complexity of being a citizen. All of the kind of rules and regulations, the paperwork, the responsibilities, the cultural ties that we have. But this is not necessarily such a far-fetched idea. It's the kind of thing that's beginning to happen somewhere else in the world right now. This little card attached to a little reader that plugs into a laptop is part of the Estonia residency program. Some of you may have heard of it. It launched a couple of years ago as an idea. The small country of Estonia sitting in the Baltics, newly independent in the past decade or so, has a history of both close relations with a lot of countries in its region, with Finland, with the rest of the Baltics, with Germany, with Poland, etc. But also has had a kind of local neighbor in Russia that from time to time has sort of owned it and let it go, had citizens kind of moving in and out across the border. And the Estonians thought, you know what, we're an innovative country. We're small, we're only 10 million people, but we've made some great things. Skype came from Estonia. some of the sort of newest and most innovative technology has come from Estonia. And they said, you know, we can take advantage of some of these things that we have as a skill and a talent locally, our technology know-how, our place in the world, our relationships, and maybe we can actually become a sort of hosting service that allows people to become residents from other parts of the world, and they can actually be digital resident of Estonia. You sign up, you pay, I think, $150 roundabout. You, at least initially, made a quick visit to a consulate or embassy, signed some paperwork, and a few months later, you get this card in the mail. Easy as that. You actually become a digital resident of Estonia. Now, this doesn't necessarily give you full rights of residency, but it opens the door to allow you through, if you're a tech person, allow you through the firewall, allow you through the portal into the country of Estonia. And thousands of people have actually taken advantage of this worldwide, both when it first launched and then again after the Brexit vote a couple of months ago. So there's over 13,000 people from around the world have applied to become e-residents of Estonia. Net physical migration was just above 15,000 actual physical people moving into Estonia in 2015. The birth rate is around 14,000 people a year. So if you think about that, in a year and a half, you suddenly have this new class of people who have access to the infrastructure, the services, and most importantly, the kind of innovation culture of a country that's equivalent to the number of new babies being born in that country every year. And they're really, really ambitious about this. They've gone all in on this kind of project. They're aiming for 10 million people to become e-residents of Estonia by 2025. Now, let that sink in for a moment. 10 million people who are a kind of digital resident of a country, not physically present there, but digital resident of a country that only has 1.3 million people. That means their e-population will be twice as big as their nearest neighbor in Finland. Now, that's a kind of an unusual idea, that a country that small could suddenly not necessarily have a mass migration into the physical land of Estonia, but could open up the essence, the kind of Estonia as a service to other countries, and allow you to come through and have banking services, legal services, the ability to set up a business, and begin to add new services to that as well. So what does this program do? It provides you the ability initially to sign digital documents, to basically do the first most essential thing in terms of a legal framework, to reach through into the Estonian legal establishment and legally sign documents that can allow you to open bank accounts of businesses, etc. It allows you to open a company, which is, for them, one of the most important things there. You don't necessarily have to have new physical businesses moving in, but you can have them place themselves inside the country, obtain the investment, the capital flows, etc. And you can open a bank account and begin to invest money in Estonia. What it doesn't yet allow you to do, it's not actual full-blown Estonian citizenship with all the rights and responsibilities that come with it. It doesn't allow you to sort of go and move in there, bring your rucksack, drop it down and say, hi, I'm here to visit my e-residency. And it doesn't necessarily provide a visa yet. But if you see the CTO of the country, the Chief Technical Officer, talk about this idea and this concept, these are the sorts of things they're moving toward. I was one of the early applicants of it. I actually didn't follow through on it because I'm a recent migrant to the Netherlands from the US. Didn't want to get my paperwork crossed up, but I had some great conversations with the team, the user experience design team behind this. Again, think about that. The user experience design of citizenship. This is a group that's actually thinking about how do we actually make this the kind of experience that the people we want to attract have in other parts of their digital lives. So if you go on today to sign on to a new service on the web, somebody shows you something and you think, I want an account on that service. You may go to something like what's called a single sign-on. You've already got a Facebook account or a LinkedIn account or a Gmail account, and you want to just use that ID and drag it over. You'll be able to just click, start the new account, and there you are. You haven't had to go through a lot of extra things. The Estonian government, the department that's in charge of this, ran a hackathon last year. John was talking about hackathons earlier as a kind of innovation concept. They ran a hackathon on an island off the coast of Estonia and invited a group of technologists and designers to come and join them and said, here's the basic idea of this. Go wild. Do whatever you want to. Do what makes sense. And we'll see if we can actually implement the best ideas. And one of the winning ideas was something called InstaVisa. There's a guy named Robert Norris and a small team that was working with him in this high school in Estonia, the high school gymnasium, got together and said, you know what? One of the most difficult things, if you've ever had to apply for a visa to come to another country, I had to apply and get documentation to come here this week. It's hassle, it's time, it's money, it's uncertainty, it's dealing with unfamiliar and often very outdated online systems and services. What if you could just click and take your Estonian e-visa and apply all across Europe, or even maybe other parts of the world? Maybe this becomes your kind of single federated identity that you can use. Think about, there's 17 million people who applied for visas just within the Schengen zone of continental Europe in 2014. How many of those people had to go back and forth and back and forth? I can't tell you how many times when I moved from the US to Amsterdam last year, I had to go digging for paperwork that I thought was missing, misunderstand an application procedure. What if I could have just clicked and dragged and everything would have been simple? And so this is the kind of idea that they're thinking about. How do you make clicking to become a resident that easy, or clicking to become a visitor that easy, and be able to actually go to a conference or move your business or have meetings or rejoin family? And you think about that kind of experience contrasted with really the basis of what we have today. 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia, was what actually gave us the modern concept of the nation state. You know, in your mind, you're going from a Dropbox or Gmail account to this crispy old piece of vellum. This is an old, I believe this is a Turkish passport from the 1800s. And this is essentially kind of where the travel system still sits today. If you're a human being and you're trying to get from one point to another point, you're carrying piles of information, lots of paperwork to try to prove that you are who you say you are, that you're a viable human being that should be allowed into a particular region or jurisdiction. Money doesn't have to deal with this. Money moves from bank to bank, from pocket to pocket, from company to company, from individual to individual, fluidly around the world. This is one of our first priorities, right? To keep the sort of economic capital flows happening globally. Things like the euro came about and to eliminate some of the complexity, give us a single currency. How is that working out? Okay, let's hope it stays that way. But money can move wherever you want to in the world. In fact, money can move too easily. Trillions of dollars of dark economies that money can drift into and come back out of. Money for political campaigns, money for dodgy investments, money for offshore investments, all of that money just moves. Data can move even faster than money now. In fact, money is data and data is money now. This is a map of submarine cables throughout the world, not even the kind of terrestrial data networking maps. Apologies that the most important part of the world is set off to the side. I've put in a request about this, but so far I'm still waiting. Shows you that this map was made in Europe, right? Some things never change. But you can see the kind of interconnectivity in the billions and hundreds of billions of dollars that have been spent by companies like Optus and others to lay cable around the world to allow data to move in and out of jurisdictions with very little friction. That, of course, actually is also changing. You're beginning to see countries begin to close their borders around the movement of data. But the point still stands, money and data can move. But if you're an individual in meat space, if you're a kind of human being, this is what you still run into. I have to give compliments to the Australian Border Agency that when I came through the other night, the gentleman was incredibly friendly. He almost surprised me. I didn't realize that he was checking my passport. He was so friendly. I can definitely contrast this with the many times that I come and go through the UK border, and it's gotten kind of tricky lately. And often this is the kind of worry that we run into. Well, I travel all of this way to do business, to see my family, to rejoin a loved one, to find new opportunity, to find safety, to find shelter, to start a new life or to visit a new place, and I'm going to run into the complexity of bureaucracy and the difficulty of a human standing in front of me saying, you can't do that. And yet, we're building all these technology platforms to allow people to work anywhere they want to, as John was just talking about, to stay any way they want to, or anywhere they want to take any kind of transportation they want to. And if you're even not wealthy, privileged, and able to move around, but are the kinds of people that we have millions of around the world who are facing difficulty, facing threats, whether from politics, economics, climate, refugees, are also making amazing uses of technology. A lot of the migration that's been coming out of Syria because of the conflict there, and Afghanistan and Iraq, these groups have taken it upon themselves to avoid human traffickers, use Facebook, use Gmail, use chat apps, use WhatsApp, use their smartphones to get to safety in other countries. They're also using this technology, they're taking it upon themselves. The first question they ask is, where can I recharge my mobile? As soon as people climb out of the raft. This is an actual quote from a journalist who was saying, when he encounters people off of southern Italy, that's where the first thing they need to do is call home or reconnect with people that they've been in migration with. But that idea doesn't go down well with some of the political powers around the world. Theresa May, the new Prime Minister of the UK, recently at the Conservative conference back in August or September, had a famous quote. And she said, if you consider yourself a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. That's a pretty strange thing to say in the modern world. I understand that there are still laws, there are regulations, there's culture, there's society, there's some deep, deep meanings to citizenship, but at the same time, the world is shifting and people are moving whether they're allowed to or not. They're actually trying to move from one place to the next and reach economic and social opportunity. And yet, these are the things we've been told. There were a 29% increase in applications for Irish passports after Brexit. I gave a version of this talk the day before the Brexit referendum at the European Commission. And there were some grumpy older gentlemen who were there from the commission who were like, this is nonsense. This is crazy talk. What do you mean that we could actually have a change in people's attitudes around migration and citizenship? The next day, the vote goes quite unexpectedly, and immediately, a lot of my own peers were digging through their own kind of family records to find out if they could apply for access to remain part of the European Union that they had grown up with, that they found to be important. And it's even going so far now as, this is Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London. He is seriously talking about, if Britain leaves the EU, having special London work permits created to allow people to still work in the city, not the country, the city of London, and maintain that kind of access to the city itself, because he realizes that the economy, the cultural livelihood of his city, and everything that people love about it has to be maintained through keeping these doors open and allowing people through to bring what they can bring to the culture of the city itself. Professor of law at University of Wisconsin put it really well recently. What's happening is that right now the nation state is losing its grip. We're seeing this in kind of politics and friction around the world. We're seeing it in elections. We're seeing it in the US. We're seeing it in Britain, we're seeing it in Australia, we're seeing it in China, we're seeing it all over the world. Countries are trying to grapple with what it means to change in the digital age, what it means to not open borders wide open for mass migration, no questions asked, but to grapple with people's recognition that they have agency and that if they see opportunity or they see safety somewhere else in the world, they're going to go for it. And they have the technology to make that happen. And how do governments catch up with that idea? So just in closing, a couple of questions to go away and think about. What is the essence of a country? What does it mean? Does it mean what the history books or the economics books or the political books have told us for the last few hundred years, that it's simply a legal construct? Is it something that is more than that? Why are we having something like open state? It's to discuss and debate and learn and talk openly about the ideas of what a state can do, whether it's a region, a city like Adelaide, a country, or a part of the world. What can it offer to other parts of the world and people in other parts of the world to make it more prosperous, to help it grow, to make it richer, and kind of continue to create that fabric of society that served us so well? How do we extend the best of what's about a country to other people in the world? How do you actually provide growth shelter and opportunity to others. Not just economic opportunity, but social opportunity, political opportunity. And I think this shelter piece is important as well. This is not just about wealthy people, who are white middle class being able to move where they want to, but everyone else has to stay. This is about giving all populations the opportunity to reach the things that they need and want. And not just for the best and the brightest and the most mobile, not just for people like me who were able to be an economic migrant twice, but to those who are most in need, home and abroad. Not just bringing them here, but how do you project Australia, how do you project South Australia, how do you project Adelaide, or whatever city or region you're from, to the rest of the world as a service. And to sum up, using a phrase from the CTO of Estonia, land in a way is so yesterday. We really have to, without doing insult to the beautiful ideas of citizenship as we've known them, or the rights of entry, think differently about how we deal with people and how we use technology to deal with people to create richer cultures, more fast-growing opportunity, and to ultimately reach a better society. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. Thanks for the invite. Always a bit challenging when you're doing short talks like this to make sure you don't overlap over other people too much. But I'm going to stick to my rails and stick into the blockchain space. Great to be back in South Australia. Great to see some good faces or friendly faces in the audience. MP, hi, how are you? Bob, hi, good to see you hiding back over there. I've got a bit of a cold. I've been fighting that, so I'm going to move around the stage and keep my energy level up. If I have to dive back for my water bottle, apologies for that. So Data61, fairly new business unit inside of CSIRO, but 1,500 researchers. Right button, there we go. What do I do inside there? I work in the insight team. So John this morning spoke about actionable insight. That's what we do. So I work mainly in the strategic foresight space, and what we do is we combine that with data and with science to provide that actionable intelligence or insight. What we tend to do is tell stories. Unfortunately, I tend to do this a lot, and I usually speak a lot longer, so I'm going to try and keep it quick today. So we'll shoot on through. What I'm going to talk to you about is essentially distributed ledger technology, and I might fall back and use DLT as the shorthand for that. What that is the more official term for blockchain. So we're going to talk about what that is, and then we're going to talk about how government can use that. Where we're going to start our story is, oops, I need to go back. Can we go back? There we go. Is with the internet. 20 years ago, I started my career about a couple hundred meters from here working at an ISP. Got my first dial-up modem. I was yet to get a Nokia mobile phone at that particular point in time. The user experience back then was prehistoric to the wonders that we have today. And for many of us, that's where we thought the genesis of the internet was. The internet actually comes from some foresight that was done coming out of World War II. The United States government was looking at what do they do in the event of a nuclear strike that takes out one of their cities, how do they keep information flying across the country? That then diffused into academia, and then that moved on to more and more people. The problem is we don't trust those people, and we had a system that was designed and built on trust. It was an open platform, so we have to retrofit all this information security into that space now. So we have to think about privacy, we have to think about how do we access information and let certain people access certain things, but not others. What we're really talking about in this space is trust. Trust is an emotion, it's a lived experience. We put these things in place, but really we only adopt things and we only feel comfortable when we have that emotional connection. Information management at the moment is pretty messy. In government, I've often been forced to use spreadsheets when you shouldn't really be using spreadsheets. Spreadsheets aren't really designed for using text, and how many places do we see that do that? So not only are we doing that in the first place, but if you get access to a spreadsheet, you've pretty much got access to all the information within the spreadsheet, and then you've got access to modify that spreadsheet, but where and when was that information modified? So there are copies on USB sticks, on network shares, on laptops, all over the place. So it's a bit of a mess. What DLT gives us the opportunity to do is to essentially try and fix up some of that mess. So if we imagine that I'm entering information in a row on a worksheet, And we have the same formatted worksheet, so you're working on a worksheet as well. Once I've entered my transaction into my row, and you entered your transaction in your row, it goes into the cloud. And then other people working on their rows, that goes into the cloud as well. And then after a certain amount of time, what happens is someone comes along with a big timestamp and goes, click, and that worksheet becomes locked. And that locked worksheet is our block. Now, it doesn't just stop there. So we may not want to put all of our information onto that row. So it might be that it's commercially sensitive information. There might be something else and some other reason we don't want to have other people actually see what's there, but we want to verify that, yes, that was what was in the transaction. So we put a digital fingerprint there that proves that this is that data. This represents that data, but it can't be turned around and you can't work out what that data was, but this is a unique identifier. So this digital fingerprint is known as a hash function or one-way function. So I put my fingerprint up there. I might digitally sign it to say, yes, I authorize that this information is true and correct. What we then do is all these rows on this worksheet, we then take a fingerprint of all the fingerprints, like a big super digital fingerprint, and we slap that down on that block. And so there's integrity, there's mathematical integrity to this block. We can all trust that what is on there is accurate. Then what we do to link all this together is we take that big digital fingerprint and we slap it on the next block that comes along. What that gives us then is a chain that goes all the way back through the blocks to the very, very first block, which is often known as the genesis block. So we have this giant ledger, this immutable ledger. Now, it's really tamper evident, but it's called an immutable ledger. That is essentially the core component of the blockchain. There are other things which are going on, and you're not going to walk out of here being blockchain engineers, but that's really the fundamental idea. And I'm mentioning that, and I have to do that first because we're finding there's a lot of stuff that's lost in translation when we talk about this. So we're working on better ways to tell that story, to say, hey, here's actually what the technology is. So it's not a database. I often hear people talk about it as a metaphor, as a database. The problem is that databases are updatable. You can change things, modify things, do all sorts of stuff. With this, you've got that transaction history. It does a lot of good things. Now, in the Bitcoin example, which was the first use case, what this meant was it solved the double spend problem. So if I have a digital asset and it's dematerialized, it only exists as zeros and ones, and I take it and I give it to Bob, then what's to stop me giving it and copying it and giving it to, say, Emily over here? What happens is if we look in this ledger, we can see that, yes, we'll take out one of the blocks. Here we have a record saying that I gave it to Bob, and then if we move further along, we can see that Bob gave it to someone else, and we can follow the history and the transaction of those Bitcoins. Again, it's not as simple as that, but that's essentially the idea. So we have visibility over all these transactions. So we now have faith in blockchain because it's been running for a few years now, and it's a contained ecosystem, and it's been working quite well. So what does it give us? It gives us trust in an untrusted environment. It's essentially an anti-fraud tool. It has a fantastic audit trail. It has less friction. The technical term is it reduces transaction costs because we don't have to check things all the time, and it might actually be a disintermediary. So we might lose someone from the chain, which again lowers the transaction cost. Excuse me for a second. It also creates greater transparency. So in the Bitcoin model, you get to see every single transaction that's going on. And in some use cases, and we're talking about Bitcoin to start with here, but we're moving on to others, people don't actually remove people from the chain. So there's not less actors, but it means that everybody can see what's going on. And that tends to make things run better. So everyone's got really, really excited. So here's a quote from the head of the Bank of England. Blockchain is the start of the fourth information revolution. So Gartner's hype cycle is a great shortcut for me to explain to you the diffusion of innovation. So I spend a lot of time looking at how innovation gets picked up, where it goes, what happens, all those sorts of things. So what happens is there's a new project, a new tech, a new whatever. It gets talked up. There's a lot of hype. We hit the top. It turns over. What happens is reality doesn't mix with or meet perception. And then when that's realized, we start to fall down. And then at some point later on, we finally work our way up to somewhere in between at that point. And you'd think if we knew about biases like these, that therefore we wouldn't be subject to them, but unfortunately we are. We get stuck in frames of reference. So what happens is at the very start of these things, everyone just keeps going and looking at it in a linear way and keep going, it's only going to go up. We hit the top, and then what happens is everyone goes, oh, it's only going to go down. Now, we're looking out further when we do this study, and we're saying it's going to be productive in the longer term, but we can see that this hype cycle is actually playing out right now at the moment. So where does Gartner think it is? Gartner thinks it's there. So, okay, cool. Gartner does an awful lot of work, but independently, we're finding that there's a lot of other measures out there as well. So Google searches is one. Q3 in last year, 2015, particularly the banking and finance sector started to spend a significant amount of money on research and development in this space. So there's an awful lot of interest, a lot of hype, a lot of things going on. However, trust is contextual. You would trust your surgeon to do surgery on you. You would trust your mechanic to fix your car. You probably shouldn't trust your surgeon to fix your car. You probably shouldn't trust your mechanic to do your surgery. In the Bitcoin example, we're talking about a contained ecosystem. That digital dematerialized asset is expressed in that immutable ledger. So we can all see that. The problem is, in the real world, the proofs of concept that we're seeing at the moment are spilling out into items which are physical assets. Now, that's not a bad thing. We could potentially increase the trust in that transaction, in that economy, in that environment where that is playing out, but it's not necessarily as absolute as a digital asset which is expressed completely and wholly and solely in that space. Now, some things more so than others. You might have heard about diamonds and Everledger. Great example. When you're talking about grain and meat and milk and supply chains, you might be able to work out if that's the container that landed over offshore, but is that our product which is sitting on the shelves over there? That's another question. So what's happened, we fear, is there's been a bit of loss in translation. So the IT people have been saying, hey, I've got this great mechanism, it does trust, blah, 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 blah. And the business people, the senior executives, the decision makers are saying, oh, trust, excellent. We can use that for, I've got this trust problem over here. So that's a barrier that we need to work through at the moment. Another one that's happened is there's a lot of smart contracts happening out there as well with blockchain. And smart contracts, unfortunately, are neither smart nor contracts. So we fear there's been a bit of loss in translation, so we think we might be getting close to that tipping point and it might start to turn down. Some of the other challenges we're currently facing in this space, which might result in that downturn, are things such as the challenge around blockchain bloat. So that immutable ledger, which is going to keep on growing, here's an example from the Bitcoin blockchain. It doubled in size over the last year. It's now at about 87 gig. So you don't have to download that every time, but as you can see, that is a fairly small blockchain. It has very little amount of information compared to some of the proof of concepts we're seeing out there where people want to store a lot of information in this ledger. So that's a challenge. There's research going on in this space, but it's an issue we're going to have to deal with. So that's not a typo. Computers compute, and so we're talking about compute here. The challenge is, if you want to store information on this immutable ledger, it's always going to be there. So if you think you're encrypting sensitive information, whether that's personally identifiable information or something else which could be FOIable and you don't want it to be, the problem is that encryption going to stand up 5, 10, 20 years from now? And you might think, oh, we'll have a new system by then, but as we know, lots of systems tend to hang around for a long time. So we could see, something come along that could defeat your encryption in a trivial sense, especially if something like a black swan, it's not really a black swan, something like quantum computing really kicks off. Another problem, as I mentioned before, the immutable ledger, what happens if you get toxic data on there? So there's already questionable material on some of the public blockchains which are out there. If you put something onto one of these ledgers, it could always be there depending on how you design it. So what if it's something which is sensitive, classified? What if it's something that you don't want to be FOIable, but it turns out that you've put onto a system that can be? What if it's information that should never be released and now it's somewhere where it could be at the end of the day? Now, there is some research going on in this space to say maybe we can edit these immutable blockchains, and that's fine, but do we lose trust and faith in the system if now something that we put our faith into because it was all immutable and we could see everything that was going on can now be edited? So, It's not all doom and gloom. We think there's going to be productivity at the end. So we think that there will be high value and disruptive use cases in all the sectors, services, manufacturing, construction, agriculture, and mining. Not just supply chain, but in lots of information asset areas as well. And if you think that those areas will start to be disrupted by digital innovation, and here I've got a graph of the IoT projection, so that blue curve going up is talking about 200 billion devices in the planet in 2025. Just think of the amount of information that could generate. Now we could do something to make it more trusted. We could also trust the configuration of the devices as well, because we could put the configurations into the ledger. So we could potentially have a much more robust ecosystem out there than we currently do on the internet. Now, getting to use cases in government. Everyone's talking about registries because you can dematerialize things. You can put stuff onto the register, the stuff that's in the register, you can put straight into a ledger, a DLT. May I suggest to you that this is a technology which should be used in conjunction with other technologies. It's not a replacement, it's not a silver bullet. So, for example, if you had a database which is a registry and that's the crown jewels for your department and you really need to protect that and that's where your core business is, then potentially why don't you think about using blockchain as a secure conveyor belt to share information with one or more parties where you have great visibility as to what's going on in that transaction, but also you're not sharing everything at the end of the day. So we're thinking that it's going to be part of a larger ecosystem. Every man and his dog is doing a licensing system for every man and his dog. The problem we're seeing, though, is that people are looking at their solutions like this, and we need to think much broader. How are they going to interoperate? Is that a word? How are they going to work together? So you might be aware that Standards Australia has just won the rights to be the secretariat for the blockchain or DLT standards for the world here in Australia, and we're going to be working with them closely looking at those sorts of issues. Workflow is a massive area. I could do a talk just on workflow with DLT. I'll give you a quick HR example. I've moved around from state to state, from federal to state government as well. I've taken my long service leave and all my entitlements with me everywhere I've gone. It's been a hassle. That's been a lot of man hours for myself, for HR, for all the previous employees that I keep having to go back to. What if that was kept in some sort of ledger and followed me around? Now, it doesn't just have to be HR and long service and entitlements. It could be performance. It could be a whole bunch of things. And it doesn't just have to be the individual as well. It can be a whole lot of other areas that we're looking at. In workflow too, I'll leave that one alone. I'll get worked up on that one. Performance. If you're subject to the PGPA Act, you might be aware that there's an idea around earned autonomy, and you need to demonstrate that you can do things. What we can start to do and what we can start to think about is a web of accountability. So at the moment, say in your annual report, the CE or whoever signs off and says, yes, we're going to do great things, or we are doing great things, we could potentially start to trace that information much more. We could have a lot more sunshine in government. However, you need to think about how you're going to implement this. DLT could be really disruptive for government because it could cast a lot of sunlight very fast, and we need to worry about cultural awareness and how soon and how quickly the organisations are going to be willing to take that up. For example, I used to work in risk, and I would used to go and say, hey, the committee said X, so what about that? And people go, oh, no, we didn't say that. It was the interpretation of the note taker or the secretariat or whoever else. What if now we had people sitting around a table and those actions, those recommendations, whatever they came up with and they agreed to, that is now put into an immutable ledger? And that might be helped by augmented reality, where they're all playing follow the leader and they're looking at the same piece of text and they're all editing it and they go, yes, we agree, that's the set of words. Or there is some type of voice recognition system which is helping them and enabling them in this space. I would dare say that there will be a lot of resistance to that type of thing coming online in the near future. Maybe down the track, maybe in a carefully controlled way, but we need to be careful about how we bring that in. And joined up government, we need to think about how these chains interact with each other. Very quickly, body cameras doing really good things, increasing people's behavior, both the people wearing them and the people in front of them. We could potentially use blockchains to increase the integrity of that event by encapsulating time stamp, GPS, and also making sure that the video has not been altered as well. So why not start to think about giving them to fireys, to ambos, to anybody, one of our people on the front line who might be in harm's way. This particular use case is looking at the extension of the thing that John also mentioned around open data. So if we're talking about open data, now exporting data sets out to people, and we've already seen a few issues where we've had to retract that and go, actually, we didn't think about that too well. What we might want to do is also think about where we go, we're not going to give you data. We're already thinking about how we're doing that, and we're doing that. But in some situations, if you've got data, we might want to verify that that data is correct. So we're not going to give it to you, but we're going to verify if you have it. So here's an example, here's a narrative to explain a situation where that may play out. So imagine that, so first of all, I've never taken a class where I've been taught what a police officer can do, or what their badge looks like, or anything like that. I'm not sure if anybody else has either. What if we had a smartphone app, and a police officer fronts up to me and says, I want to do such and such. Well, I've got no idea if they can or they can't. I usually, people go on that shorthand abstraction. They go, oh, person in uniform asking me something, sure, I'll comply. What if I took a mobile phone and I could match the face to the badge and securely go, yes, that person is who they say they are, because I've got this government distributed app which is looking at that, and the app tells me that yes, they can do that. Is that something that we want to look at? Now that's just a narrative and an idea, but it just starts to open that broad perspective as what sort of things can we now do in this space? And also that's an illustration of, we're looking at really hybrid private versus public blockchains being more of the implementations. So the public one being Bitcoin, people are thinking about the back office private ones. We're actually thinking that there's going to be that sort of intersection where we're going to start to share data in new and novel ways. So, to summarize, proceed with caution. As I mentioned at the beginning, the way we design the internet has had ramifications for decades and decades. Unfortunately, we like to think that we're being agile, but sometimes we put stuff in and it hangs around for a long time. So, use foresight. Consider the bigger picture. I probably didn't go through it in too much detail, but we are starting to think and see that the networks of these blockchains interacting with each other will increase the trust in the whole transaction space. So really lifting the economy or the ecosystem that it's part of. Please have a valid business case. The number of proof of concepts I'm seeing at the moment are going because blockchain. What's the public good? What's the value that's being created? And lastly, you will make mistakes. It's good to make mistakes, but learn from your mistakes and try and learn from the mistakes of others. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think the requirement of all speakers this morning is that they speak fast. That is the primary requisite. I'm going to try and do my best. I'm going to talk about digital adaptation and the concepts of adaptation, and what it might mean to us if we apply adaptive mindsets to the biggest challenges that we face as a society, as businesses, individuals. But I want to start by talking a little bit about what an adaptive mindset actually looks like, and tell you some stories of it. In June 2013, Lieutenant General David Morrison, then chief of an organization that prided itself as the best small army in the world, made a very powerful statement about inclusion, about equity, about respect within his organization. His video message was viewed more than 1.5 million times, and it showed the power of a simple, clear message to cut through complexity, to really get to the heart of an issue, to focus people's minds on the need to adapt to a new reality. But I want to focus on another concept that he helped to develop in the previous 10 years, much lesser known, but really, really important. It's the concept of adaptive campaigning. He and his peers developed this concept and committed the Australian Army for it to be their fundamental concept. It's the concept of adaptive campaigning. And adaptive campaigning came from a realization that although the nature of war is enduring, its characteristics change, and they change rapidly. They change because they're influenced by an interplay between state and non-state actors, between technology and social forces, between communication of events and ideas that rapidly emerge. He recognized, and his peers recognized, that war is a complex adaptive system, an interplay of different actors who behave in a way in aggregate that is often highly disruptive, often highly non-predictable. At the core of adaptive campaigning, is a concept called the adaptation cycle. It's a cycle that has 4 stages: act, sense, decide, adapt. But act is the first stage. And that's really important because it breaks tradition of traditional military thinking that we must first observe, orient, understand, analyze, strategize before we take decisive action. No, he said, and the Australian Army now says, that we must first act. Because it's only by acting that we can understand our own capabilities, the environment in which we operate, the response that our enemy will take. It's only by acting that we can understand what way the environment will respond to our actions. It's only by acting that we can figure out the right set of decisive steps to take in order to strategically win. This is the fundamental operating concept of the Australian Army, probably the most hierarchical, rigid organization in Australia, and yet that's their operating concept that they're committed to. And it really came tested in quite a few cases over the last 10 years. An example I want to tell you is Operation Spingar, which was in 2007. The Australian task force was deployed to the Estonia province. They had a particular mission to defend the Dutch Reconstruction Task Force around Tarankot. The challenge was that the Taliban had freedom of movement in an area called the Baluchi Pass, north of Tarankot. They were preparing for a summer offensive. The Australian task force was deployed in 2007, and their very first operation was Operation Spingar. The operation intent was to progressively expand into Taliban territory, to put pressure on the Taliban to withdraw so that reconstruction could proceed. But what's really interesting is the way the Australian Army took an approach to this. They first of all started engaging with the community. They met with the leaders of that community in Estonia. They started to do patrols and understood the way that the Taliban responded to those patrols. They started building a first checkpoint, and as they built that checkpoint, the Taliban behavior changed, and they started monitoring that and adapting. They changed the US policy of cordon and search to an idea called cordon and visit, a much more sensitive, much more targeted way of isolating an area and performing search operations that kept the community on side. They went forward and they deployed a second checkpoint, then a third checkpoint, expanding into Taliban territory. And eventually, when the third checkpoint was in place, they deployed a forward patrol base right in the middle of 3 Taliban strongholds. Taliban didn't know how to respond to this. This was incursion into their central operating area. They didn't know where the next attack and the next movement would come from. The Taliban withdrew and they canceled their summer offensive. The commanding officer of that was Lieutenant Colonel David Wainwright. He was one of the main authors of adaptive campaigning. He understood that modern warfighting was all about effect and influence within a complex adaptive system. And although it's written in the language of conflict, I would argue that this concept is very appropriate to how we think about disruptive innovations, disruptive challenges, and how we can respond to them as individuals or as businesses or as societies. Mark Prensky was an education researcher, and he coined the phrase digital native. And he wrote this paper that made this arbitrary line. It said that if you were born after 1980, you're a digital native. So you're under 36 if you're in this audience, and you're a digital native. The rest of us can only ever be digital immigrants. We might even be digital refugees forever. Now, the challenge with that is that 65% of the Australian workforce is therefore a digital immigrant. Now, that excludes me. It excludes all of those. It excludes more than half of the Australian population. I don't think that's true. I don't believe it, and the reason why is because I think it's an arbitrary, false, and very simplistic perspective of the role of digital technologies and digital capability. The reality is that the guys who are in your workplace who are intimately familiar with Facebook and Twitter and are using a smartphone, very few of them are actually skilled, capable, and empowered enough to apply those digital techniques to their day-to-day work. The digital transformation that's happening that John talked about earlier is about a lot more than just a smartphone and a social media account. It's about applying connected technologies, sensors, big data, communication tools. It's about machines and systems that can think and act independently. But way, way more than that, it's about having the digital skills and the attitude and the willingness to learn and adapt, to use these tools for real impact. I want to try and talk for a second and clarify when I say the term complex and adaptive, what I mean by that. What is the meaning of a complex adaptive system? Because it's not the same thing as complicated. A complex adaptive system is composed of agents that are interacting, that are relating to one another, each of those agents having their own characteristics, their own behaviors. Each of those agents are subject to feedback that may be positive to reinforce their behavior, or might be negative to dampen their behaviors. And a complex adaptive system is quite a well-understood construct. And what's really interesting about this is how behaviors emerge from this interplay of relationships and these feedback loops. Complex is not complicated. Your car is complicated. The coral reef is complex. A smartphone is complicated. The Pokemon craze that's disturbing us is complex. It is crazy, but it's complex. Why is this interesting? Because it's interesting because the most interesting challenges, the greatest challenges we face, all exist within complex adaptive systems. The tremendous work of some of the colleagues of Robin in the CSIRO, Dr. Stefan Hakowitz, very eloquently describes these 7 global megatrends affecting Australia. He talks about trends around congestion in our cities, the challenges of our cities, the challenges of loss of biodiversity, and the environmental impact of climate change. He talks about the consequence of the migration of the economic gravity of the world towards Asia. What will happen when we all live past 90? What is the meaning of this craze towards digital experiences, while we also value personal and relational experiences? What will happen with that kind of change? And most of all, what is the imperative to innovate and continuously strive forward with innovation and technology in particular? What's interesting about all of these challenges is that they all exist within complex adaptive systems. They all exhibit behaviors where a small change in incentives or behaviors or relationships can actually lead to really big and dramatic aggregate behavior. And they're all working in areas where technology innovation in particular has the potential to create moments of free fall. Moments where the rules get rewritten, where technological change rewrites our expectations, and it smashes the belief or even the hope that we have that change will be incremental and gradual and slow, and we will have time to deal with it. These are all existing within complex adaptive systems. But I want to tell you some stories to relate to this, and some Australian stories. One I'll start with is the Australian Institute of Chartered Accountants. There's been a lot of talk about and a lot of research into the consequence of automation. And what will it mean to our workforce? In Australia, there's been studies by CETA to say that the Australian workforce, about 30% is at high risk of automation by 2030. And these aren't jobs like just manual workers or factory workers. These are jobs of clerical, accounting, legal, professional, sales, government policy and bureaucratic people, government leaders. It is absolutely across the board risk of automation. Now, to their credit, the Institute of Chartered Accountants recognize this. They recognize that actually accountancy is one of the top skills at risk of automation. And so they said, we need to address this. We need to understand this and approach it, or else it will affect our members and it will affect our standing as an organization. So they worked with us and some of their partners to put in place a big data platform. The simple concept they had is this, that if they could help accountants who are serving their clients to bring the data of their clients into a capable platform where they could perform analysis and investigation and gain insights, to visualize that detail, to share it back to the members and back to their clients, then there would be new services, new insights that those accountants could bring. So they built this platform, and they established it, and it's proving very successful. They then went on to train accountants and their membership on data science, on machine learning, on concepts around data analytics. And we may well find that the 100,000 accountants in Australia are not performing the tasks of accountants as we think about them right now. But maybe in the near future, we will have 100,000 financially literate data scientists to fuel the innovation that we need to drive in our society. That's adaptive thinking. That's being open to the signals and being responsive to it. But you have to be aware and you have to be open and responsive. And so I'll give you another example a little closer to home of Adelaide City Council. Now, Adelaide City Council, like many local government organisations here in Australia, run their council meetings in a very open and transparent way. They open it to the public. The challenge is that they run those meetings in a room that might fit 50 people at most. And there's a physical challenge of actually being there to listen and participate within the conversation. And they noticed that there was a declining participation, and people weren't coming, and people weren't engaging. And that presented a challenge to the council because they weren't hearing the feedback from the community. So we and some partners worked with them to put in place a really simple solution. Instead of requiring physical presence, they streamed live and real-time over the internet their council meetings. And they allowed it to happen in a two-way, where it's possible for, at the other end of the line, to participate and to comment and to read materials and to pick and choose how you want to participate. They now, on average, have 130 people participating remotely in those council meetings. Some meetings have had 500 people. And that provides a really interesting dynamic back to council, so that they have now a better pool of feedback and guidance and engagement coming, so that they can be more responsive, they can be more adaptive to the changes of the community, and be able to make good decisions for the future of Adelaide. Another local example, or close enough. I wouldn't have to convince too many people here in Adelaide the value of a nice glass of chilled white wine and an oyster. If you're in Tasmania, maybe here too, you realize that if it's been a recent rainfall event, though, oysters are off the menu. And the reason why is because oysters, as filter feeders, are very sensitive to water pollution. And so in the event of a heavy downfall of rain in Tasmania, the oyster fisheries are shut down across Tasmania. Now, that's done because if the contaminants get into the oysters and people eat them, they can get very ill. And so all farmers, all regulators want to avoid that at all costs. And so they will be very conservative in terms of shutting down those farms. The technique they use is rainwater gauges that are manually checked and inspected. And when those rainwater gauges go beyond a certain line, they shut down the oyster farms. Now, if it's Christmas and you have a rainfall event and you shut down an oyster farm, that can be $100,000 worth of foregone revenue per day for a Tasmanian oyster farmer. Enter a small little company called The Yield. And The Yield has worked with us and with Bosch and with the Tasmanian government. And what they do is they put sensors in place in the estuary that are digitally collecting the water salinity levels, the water temperature. They're real-time feeding that up into the cloud. There we perform machine learning and analysis on that. That analysis gets fed to the regulators in Tasmania so that they can more accurately inform when a shutdown event should happen. It's also fed directly to the oyster farmer themselves on their smartphone. And it's this cycle of real-time sensing, deciding, and then enabling action that is the characteristic of a complex adaptive system and a characteristic of adaptive thinking. And so they're deploying this right now, and the yield is looking at, well, how do we take this further? How do we deploy it to other oyster farms? How do we deploy it to irrigation systems across Australia? How do we use this to feed our population in more effective ways without ruining our planet? One last example I'll give you to highlight the fact that sometimes the biggest challenges get dealt with by the smallest ideas and the simplest ideas. There's a company called Redback Technologies in Queensland. They have a very simple proposition. They want to make Australia entirely carbon neutral, running on renewable energy. How they do that is they provide battery storage and remote management of those batteries. Now, Australia, and actually South Australia, is leading the way in the adoption of photovoltaic cells in homes. There's about 1.5 million roofs in Australia have photovoltaic installations. It actually contributes only about 2 or 3% of our energy needs, but that's 10 times more than 5 years ago. 10 times more than 5 years ago. And the predictions for photovoltaic efficiency is that in 10 years' time, it will get close to being the most efficient, cost-efficient mechanism for energy production and management that is available to us. So Redback Technologies provide these batteries and the storage mechanisms, but the really interesting thing is they instrument them. And they instrument them in a way where the data around consumption and usage is transmitted to the cloud. There it's analyzed. There they can set parameters around either guiding the consumer to change their consumption patterns, or guiding the consumer, enabling them to actually sell at peak times, sell their energy from their batteries into either a local grid, it can be an off-grid scenarios, or into the national grid. Little surprise that Energy Australia 2 weeks ago announced a $10 million investment into Redback to bring it out to their $1.7 million or 1.7 million subscriber base. Small things can have big impact in a complex adaptive system. And so I want to close by highlighting the most complex adaptive system that we know and that exists, and it's inside our own heads. We receive sensations. We take actions and receive sensations. And those sensations can be pleasant or they can be harsh. And the feedback that they generate guide us to either rational or irrational actions. But we act in this same way. We act, we sense, we decide, and we continuously adapt and learn. We are adaptive systems. And the great exciting thing that's happening, perhaps the greatest disruption that you and I are likely to see over the coming years, is how we implement this exact same cycle within computer systems. Artificial intelligence is the science of perception and rational action. And when you think about the Internet of Things giving us perception, when you think about the cloud giving us the ability to make decisions, if you think about action through robotics, and deep machine learning giving us the ability to adapt, we are together building the most complex adaptive system we could imagine. And that will usher in, as part of changes like blockchain, the fourth industrial revolution. But that is a topic for another day. And so with that, I will say thank you very much.